At Logan's graduation, my husband Kieran stood at the microphone, giving a heartfelt speech about fatherhood and sacrifice. His phone buzzed on the seat beside me, the screen lighting up with a message from T. "This weekend works for me, handsome. Same hotel as last time. Can't wait to have you all to myself again." I flipped the phone face down and looked up to see him smiling at a woman 3 rows ahead. She wore a navy dress and had dark hair swept into an elegant twist. I smiled too, clasping my hands in my lap while my heart turned to ice. The audience had no idea they were watching my marriage end in real time. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was sharp and clear. 20 years of trust had just shattered with a single text message. Yet somehow I wasn't crying or screaming. I was calculating, planning, already 3 steps ahead. Kieran finished his speech to thunderous applause, completely unaware that the wife he'd taken for granted had just become someone he should fear. The ceremony ended with caps flying and confetti falling like snow in the bright June sunshine. Families cried happy tears and took endless photos under the banners celebrating the graduating class. Inside, I felt like I was watching everything through glass, distant and strangely protected from the chaos of emotions I should have been feeling. While Kieran hovered around the woman in navy, thanking her loudly for coming and making a show of their friendship, I pulled Logan into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered into his shoulder, and I meant every word. My son deserved this perfect day, untainted by what I'd discovered about his father. Kieran finally walked toward me, his face glowing with false warmth and satisfaction. He kissed my cheek and said something about the ceremony being beautiful and meaningful. I nodded and smiled, already knowing this wouldn't be the confrontation he expected. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a public scene or emotional breakdown. Not yet. Revenge required patience, and I'd been patient for years already. On the drive home through familiar streets lined with oak trees, Kieran talked endlessly about how supportive his friend had been throughout the renovation project he'd been working on. He mentioned needing to help her again this weekend, his voice casual and practiced like he'd rehearsed these lies 1,000 times. I watched the highway lines blur past my window and thought about the title that now defined my entire existence. My husband spent every weekend helping a friend, then told me not to worry. The words tasted bitter in my mind, like a lie I'd been swallowing for months without realizing it was poison. Each weekend excuse now replayed in my memory with new clarity and devastating context. I realized I'd been choosing blindness over truth, comfort over reality, peace over dignity. But that version of me died the moment I read that text message. Before I confronted him, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I needed evidence, documentation, and a plan so airtight he couldn't wriggle free with his charm and excuses. Late that night, after Logan fell asleep in his old bedroom surrounded by boxes of belongings ready for his dorm move, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea I'd forgotten to drink. I thought back to the woman I'd been at 28, ambitious, enrolled in a business program, dreaming of starting my own financial consultancy to help women protect their assets. Then I remembered the night Kieran convinced me to put my education on pause to help him build his renovation company from the ground up. "We'll circle back to your dreams soon," he'd promised, his eyes sincere and full of plans for our shared future. Soon never came. I'd traded my aspirations for his, believing we were building something together as equal partners. I walked to the basement and pulled out dusty boxes of old files, coughing through years of accumulated neglect. Inside were my original business plans, detailed spreadsheets I'd created, and most importantly, the contracts we'd signed when we started the company. My name was on everything. I'd forgotten my own power, buried it under years of supportive wife duties. I sat cross-legged on the cold basement floor, surrounded by papers that told the story of years spent alone while Kieran claimed to be working. Kieran working late most Fridays, disappearing on Saturdays to finish a job or help a friend, who never seemed available when I offered to bring coffee, lunch, or just visit the job site to see his progress. I remembered covering for him with Logan, telling our son that Daddy was out building a future for us, creating opportunities that would benefit our whole family someday. How many Little League games had Kieran missed while supposedly working? How many school plays and parent nights and birthday dinners? I'd made excuses for him, defended him to teachers and coaches, protected his image as a devoted father and hardworking husband. Now I wondered if he'd been building someone else's future instead, investing time and money and attention in another woman's life. The patterns were so obvious now that I was looking for them. Every weekend trip, every late-night phone call taken in another room, every sudden shower when he came home smelling of unfamiliar perfume. I'd ignored it all, choosing trust over suspicion, love over logic. The next day, while Kieran ran to pick up supplies from the hardware store, I logged into our joint bank account under the guise of paying Logan's dorm deposit and first semester fees. My hands shook slightly as I scrolled through months of transactions I'd never bothered to examine closely before. There they were, clear as day. Multiple charges to a downtown hotel called the Riverside Inn, a wine bar I'd never heard of called Moonlight Cellars, a boutique where I'd never shopped called Bella's Fashion House. All the charges fell on weekends when he claimed to be helping his friend repaint her house or fix her kitchen cabinets. One charge jumped out at me, making my stomach turn. Romance package for $247 at the Riverside Inn. I took screenshots of everything, my business training kicking in automatically after years of dormancy. Document everything. Create a paper trail. Build your case before revealing your hand. I opened a new folder on my laptop and titled it simply Evidence. Then I kept scrolling, finding more charges, more lies, more proof that my marriage was nothing but an elaborate performance for an audience of one. Me. I scrolled through old text messages until I found the thread where I'd first learned about this mysterious friend who needed so much help. Kieran had described her as a coworker whose husband had serious health issues and mounting medical bills. She needed help with home repairs she couldn't afford to hire out professionally. Being the supportive wife I'd always been, I'd encouraged his generosity without question. That's what good people do, I'd told him, actually proud of his willingness to help someone in need. Now I pulled up her social media profile, which Kieran had mentioned casually months ago when explaining how they'd reconnected. Her posts showed hiking trips through mountain trails, beach vacations in tropical locations, and cocktail photos with captions about living her best life and embracing freedom. No mention of a sick spouse anywhere on her carefully curated feed. In fact, her relationship status said single and loving it. I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Each vacation post was tagged from the same city as those hotel charges on our credit card. She hadn't been home needing repairs while her husband suffered. She'd been traveling with mine on my money, living a life I'd unknowingly funded. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear as broken glass. I hurried back to the basement and dug through a different box until I found what I was looking for. Our prenuptial agreement, yellowed slightly with age. We'd signed it 12 years ago, back when Kieran had a gambling problem that nearly destroyed us financially and emotionally. I'd inherited substantial money from my grandmother and insisted on protection before agreeing to start the business together. The lawyer had added clauses about financial misconduct and infidelity at my specific request, based on advice from a therapist I'd been seeing at the time. Kieran had signed without really reading it, desperate to prove he'd changed and worthy of my trust and investment. I sat on the cold concrete floor and read the document carefully, line by line. There it was, in clear legal language that left no room for interpretation. If I could prove infidelity combined with financial deception, the division of assets would heavily favor me, potentially leaving him with almost nothing. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just proof of betrayal. This was a weapon, carefully forged years ago by a younger, wiser version of myself who'd known to protect her future even while hoping for the best. I pulled out another document from the same box, our company's operating agreement, signed and notarized. My eyes caught on a section I'd completely forgotten about over the years of letting Kieran run things day to day. Because I'd provided the startup capital for my inheritance, the agreement listed me as holding 60% ownership of the company. Kieran had 40%. I remembered him laughing about it at the time, calling me the boss on paper, honey. like it was a cute technicality that didn't matter in real life or daily operations. He'd been running the company operations for so long that we both forgot what the paper actually said in black and white. But paper mattered in court. Paper was everything when lawyers got involved. Paper was the difference between losing half of what I'd built and keeping most of it safe from his betrayal. I photographed every page of the agreement, the prenup, and the articles of incorporation with my phone, backing everything up to 3 different cloud storage services. Then I carefully returned everything to its box, making sure to leave no evidence of my search. Kieran would never suspect I'd been down here investigating. He probably didn't even remember these documents existed in the first place. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer I found through a women's business network I joined months ago, telling Kieran I was meeting an old classmate for lunch and shopping. The lawyer's office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, giving a view of the skyline I'd once dreamed of being part of in my consulting career. I sat across from her polished desk, facing a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who listened without interrupting as I laid out everything. I showed her the prenup, the operating agreement, screenshots of bank statements showing the hotel charges and secret transfers to accounts I'd never known existed. Patricia studied the documents carefully, occasionally making notes in precise handwriting. Finally, she looked up, and I saw something like admiration in her expression. "You've already done half my job," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Most women come to me with nothing but suspicions and hurt feelings. You came with documentation and proof." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "If you keep collecting evidence at this rate, he's about to fund your new life completely." I felt something shift in my chest, something fundamental changing. Not sadness anymore, something harder, more focused, and deliberate. Purpose, direction, power I'd forgotten I possessed. Following Patricia's detailed advice, I started documenting everything in real time, like a detective, building an airtight case. I took photos of Kieran's truck parked at the Riverside Inn on a Saturday afternoon when he claimed to be at a job site across town fixing a client's deck. I copied his out-of-town invoices and cross-referenced them carefully with our client files, discovering none of the addresses matched any active projects. I downloaded bank statements highlighting transfers from our business account to a personal account I'd never known existed until last week. I didn't hack anything or break any laws that could compromise my case later. I simply looked at what I already had legal access to as his wife and business partner. Each new document made me less sad and more determined to see this through. I organized everything by date in color-coded folders that would make any lawyer proud. Red for financial deception, blue for evidence of infidelity, green for legal documents establishing my ownership and rights. By the end of the week, I had a case that would make any lawyer smile and any judge rule in my favor without hesitation. On Sunday evening, Kieran returned from helping his friend, looking relaxed and happy, whistling as he came through the door. He kissed my cheek with practiced affection, thanked me for holding down the fort, like I was some kind of employee, and joked about how the job was almost finished and he'd have his weekends back soon. He dropped his overnight bag by the door and headed straight for the shower, not noticing how I watched his every movement with new eyes. I noted the new cologne I didn't recognize, expensive and musky, and the way he seemed lighter, unburdened by the lies he'd been carrying. Over dinner, I asked casually if he'd be taking on more weekend work with his friend in the coming months. "If she needs me, of course," he said easily, reaching for the salad bowl without meeting my eyes. "That's what friends do for each other, right?" Logan talked enthusiastically about his summer plans before moving to campus, oblivious to the tension I felt coiling in my stomach like a snake ready to strike. Kieran laughed at something our son said, playing the role of devoted father perfectly for his audience. I smiled and nodded, thinking, if only you knew who really needs you right now. Not your mistress or your friend. A judge and a divorce lawyer. I dug deeper into our financials over the next few days, following a hunch I couldn't shake about money going missing. I noticed small transfers from our business account to to what appeared to be a separate checking account I'd never seen statements for. Each transfer was just under the amount that would trigger automatic alerts from the bank's fraud detection system. $500 here, $700 there. Always carefully calculated to stay under the radar. Over 2 years, according to my careful calculations, it added up to nearly $40,000 of company money. I called our bank and requested a routine statement of all accounts linked to our business taxpayer identification number. The representative, thinking nothing of the request, included everything in the packet she mailed. There it was on paper, an account in Kieran's name only, opened 18 months ago. But the current balance was only $8,000. I stared at the screen, confused and angry. If he'd transferred $40,000 over 2 years, where was the rest? Then it hit me like a physical blow. He'd been spending it. On her. On hotels and gifts and that romance package and probably jewelry and dinners I'd never know about. My money. Our company's money. Gone, spent on another woman while I paid our bills at home. I opened the graduation photos on my phone and zoomed in on a group shot I'd barely glanced at before. Kieran stood in the aisle near the front, clapping enthusiastically for Logan's achievement. Behind him in the third row, the woman in the navy dress was looking straight at him with an expression I recognized now that I knew what to look for. Not friendly. Not casual. Possessive. Intimate. Like he belonged to her. I scrolled back through my memory and remembered seeing her at our company holiday party 6 months ago, wearing red and holding a wine glass. Kieran had introduced her casually as Tessa, a client's project manager. She'd shaken my hand with a firm grip, smiled warmly at me, and complimented my dress with what seemed like genuine kindness. The whole time, she'd been sleeping with my husband, probably laughing at me behind my back. I felt rage burn through me, hot and clarifying like fire. This wasn't some distant stranger he'd met at a bar. She'd looked me in the eye, broken bread at my table during the holidays, and smiled while actively stealing my life. I saved the photo in my evidence folder. Then I searched for her name in Kieran's email account, which I had access to for business purposes. The results made my hands shake with anger. Instead of exploding or confronting him immediately, I booked sessions with a therapist Patricia had recommended. I needed to prepare mentally for what was coming, the emotional fallout and the practical challenges ahead. In her calm office filled with plants and soft lighting, I talked about years of minimizing my own needs, making myself small and quiet so Kieran could feel big and important. I'd handed him trust like a blank check, never questioning, never doubting, never protecting myself. You can grieve and still be strategic, my therapist said during our second session. Her voice gentle but firm. Those two things aren't opposites or mutually exclusive. They're both necessary for healing. She helped me understand that my composure wasn't weakness or denial or avoidance. It was a different kind of strength, one I developed over years of crisis management. The kind built from years of holding things together when everything wanted to fall apart, managing chaos when Kieran's gambling problem threatened everything, solving problems nobody else wanted to handle. I'd spent 20 years being the stable one, the responsible one, the one who kept everything running smoothly. Now I'd use those same skills to dismantle the lies and rebuild my life on honest foundations. For the first time in weeks, I felt powerful instead of broken, capable instead of helpless. One Friday evening, Kieran announced another weekend trip to wrap up the final touches at his friend's house, some story about kitchen cabinets that needed a second coat of stain. This time, I pretended to break under the pressure of his constant absences. I asked him tearfully if he even wanted to be home with us anymore, my voice shaking with practiced emotion. His eyes widened in surprise, and he pulled me into what he probably thought was a comforting hug, promising it was all for our future and the business and building something lasting. I let myself cry into his shirt, my shoulders shaking with sobs that were only half fake. He stroked my hair and murmured reassurances about love and commitment, and how this was almost over. "I love you," he said, the words sounding hollow now. "This is almost over, I promise, and then we'll have more time together." I felt him relax against me, satisfied that he'd soothed his worried wife back into submission. As he packed his bag later, whistling softly and completely at ease, He had no idea that while he was gone this weekend, I'd be meeting with Patricia to freeze certain business accounts he relied on for daily operations and personal expenses. The man who thought I was fragile and emotional was about to discover I was made of steel and strategy. I drove to the Riverside Inn, the hotel listed repeatedly on our bank statements, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I parked across the street behind a delivery van and waited, feeling like a detective in a bad movie. 2 hours passed slowly. I'd brought a book and a large coffee from the drive-thru, prepared to sit all day if necessary to get the proof I needed. Then, at 3 p.m. on a beautiful Saturday, I saw them walking toward the hotel entrance. Kieran and Tessa emerged from his truck in the parking lot, laughing at some private joke, his arm around her waist in a familiar way that made my stomach turn. She wore the kind of expensive dress that cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, probably purchased with my money. They looked happy, carefree, like people without secrets or guilt or spouses waiting at home. I got out of my car and crossed the street, my legs moving on autopilot. When I pushed through the hotel's revolving glass doors, Kieran was standing at the marble front desk checking in. He turned at the sound of my footsteps on the polished floor. The color drained from his face completely, leaving him pale and shocked. Tessa stared at me, then at him, processing what was happening. A slow smile spread across her face, cruel and amused. "You didn't tell me your wife was in town," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false innocence. Kieran grabbed my arm roughly, trying to pull me toward the exit and away from witnesses. "Let's talk outside," he hissed through clenched teeth, his grip tight enough to bruise. But I didn't move or cooperate. I looked at Tessa directly, meeting her amused eyes without flinching, and said clearly, "Oh, I'm everywhere you spend my money." Her smile faltered slightly, uncertainty creeping in. Kieran's grip tightened on my arm. "Please don't embarrass me," he whispered desperately, his voice cracking. "Not here, not like this." I turned to him calmly, pulling my arm free from his grasp. "We'll talk at home later," I said in a normal conversational tone. "You two should enjoy your evening together while you can." Then I walked out slowly and deliberately, my head high, my steps measured and controlled. I heard him call my name, but I didn't turn around or acknowledge him. As I reached my car, I glanced back through the glass doors one last time. The hotel manager was watching them with obvious confusion, probably wondering about the drama he'd just witnessed. Tessa had her arms crossed, glaring at Kieran with the first signs of doubt. He looked pale and shaken, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to explain. "Good. Let them fight. Let witnesses see the confrontation. Let the cracks in their perfect affair show publicly." I drove home feeling oddly peaceful, knowing I'd handled it perfectly. Kieran came home an hour later, stumbling through the door and launching into explanations before he even closed it behind him. She was just a friend, he insisted. The hotel was for client meetings that required privacy. The text was taken completely out of context by my suspicious mind. He tried every excuse in the cheater's playbook, his voice rising with each desperate lie. Then he switched tactics entirely, blaming me for his choices. "You've always been paranoid," he said, his tone turning accusatory. "Always looking for problems where there aren't any. Always assuming the worst about me." I let him talk himself in circles while I sat at the kitchen table, my phone recording everything with his full knowledge and consent. "I want to remember this conversation accurately," I'd told him when I started recording. He'd agreed immediately, probably thinking it proved he had nothing to hide. Then I placed the printed bank statements on the table between us like playing cards in a winning hand. The hotel charges highlighted in yellow marker. The romance package circled in red. The transfers to his secret account documented in detail. His voice faltered mid-sentence. "This isn't what it looks like," he tried weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. I asked quietly, my voice steady, "Do you remember the prenup we signed? The clauses about financial misconduct and infidelity?" His face went white as understanding dawned. "Are you talking to a lawyer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said simply, meeting his eyes without blinking. Kieran's entire demeanor changed instantly, like someone had flipped a switch in his personality. He tried begging first, his voice breaking with emotion that might have been genuine. 20 years together has to mean something to you. We built a life together. Then threatening, his tone darkening, you'll ruin both of us with this. The business will collapse without me. Everything we worked for will be destroyed. Then bargaining, desperate now. Think about Logan. Do you really want him to see his family destroyed like this? Think about what this will do to our son. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly on the table, watching him cycle through every manipulation tactic he knew. Logan deserves a mother who doesn't pretend ignorance to keep false peace, I said, my voice even and controlled. And I am the business on paper, remember? You said it yourself years ago. You joked about it. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the kitchen floor. You can't do this to me, he said, but his voice lacked real conviction now. He could see it in my eyes, the change that had happened. I wasn't the woman he'd married anymore, the one who'd sacrificed her dreams for his comfort. I was someone new, someone who'd learned exactly how much power she'd been sitting on all along while playing the supportive wife. He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I sat in the quiet house afterward, feeling nothing but cold determination and clarity about what came next. Patricia helped me assemble a professional packet for our 3 biggest clients over the next few days. It contained a detailed summary of financial irregularities I'd discovered, duplicate invoices that suggested systematic overcharging, and potential misrepresentation of project costs. We sent it anonymously from a neutral email address Patricia created specifically for this purpose, advising them professionally to review their accounts for possible misuse of funds and billing irregularities. I included supporting documents, all perfectly legal since they came from company files I had full access to as majority owner. Patricia assured me this wasn't slander or libel if the information was accurate and documented. And it was. Kieran had been padding invoices and pocketing the difference for years, using the company as his personal piggy bank. I'd found proof in his secret account statements, cross-referenced with client billing records. 2 days later, our largest client called requesting an urgent meeting to discuss some serious concerns that had been brought to their attention. They wanted to review billing records and discuss company leadership. I agreed to attend as the primary owner. Kieran had no idea the meeting was even happening, or that his world was about to collapse around him. Kieran walked into the boardroom at Jameson Properties, thinking he was pitching a new multi-property renovation contract worth over $300,000. He'd spent all morning preparing his presentation, confident and excited. Instead, he found the client's legal team seated around the long conference table with stacks of papers that looked very familiar to me. His confident smile faded when he saw me sitting at the far end near the windows. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between me and the lawyers with growing confusion. The client's attorney, a woman named Victoria Hayes, spoke first in a professional tone. "We've received information about billing irregularities and need clarification before proceeding with any new contracts." They laid out the evidence systematically, item by item. Duplicate invoices for the same work, inflated material costs that didn't match supplier receipts, charges for work that was never actually completed according to inspection records. Kieran's face went from confused to red to pale in the span of minutes as he realized what was happening. "I can explain all of this," he started, his voice shaking slightly. "Who holds majority ownership of this company?" Victoria interrupted, looking directly at him. Everyone turned to look at me expectantly. "I do," I said clearly and firmly. 60%. Kieran's mouth opened, then closed. He'd forgotten. After all these years, he'd actually forgotten the most important detail. I took a deep breath and continued speaking, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Effective immediately, I'm initiating a full internal audit and stepping in as acting CEO of the company. My words came out stronger than I felt. I want to assure you that any irregularities will be corrected promptly, and if refunds are warranted, they'll be issued with full transparency. Kieran's chair scraped loudly as he stood, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You can't do this to me." His voice cracked with panic and disbelief. "This is my company." Victoria spoke calmly, consulting her notes. Actually, according to your operating agreement filed with the state, she can. And given the concerns we've outlined here, will only continue working with this company under her direct leadership going forward. Kieran looked around the room desperately, searching for an ally or someone who would defend him, finding none. The other lawyers stared at him with professional disapproval. He grabbed his briefcase roughly and stormed toward the door, his presentation materials forgotten on the table. "This isn't over," he spat at me, his voice venomous. But his hands were shaking visibly. He knew exactly what he'd lost in this room. This was just the beginning of his consequences. Outside that boardroom, his entire carefully constructed world was crumbling, and he'd built every crack himself with his lies and betrayal. Word spread through our industry faster than I expected. By the end of the week, 3 more clients had called requesting meetings with me specifically, wanting assurance about project integrity. Tessa, who'd floated around industry events with the confidence of someone who thought she'd won the prize, suddenly found herself unwelcome at networking functions. A subcontractor I'd worked with for years called to warn me that she'd approached him about joining a new company Kieran was trying to start from scratch. "Nobody wants to touch it," he said bluntly. "Everyone knows what he did, both professionally and personally." I thanked him for the information and his loyalty. 2 days later, I heard through mutual contacts that Tessa had moved out of her expensive downtown apartment, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony. The future she'd imagined with Kieran, funded by my money and my business, had evaporated like morning fog. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a cold acknowledgement that consequences were finally arriving for both of them. Kieran had promised her a life he never actually owned or controlled. Now they both understood with perfect clarity that the woman he'd underestimated and betrayed held all the cards, all the power, and all the legal rights. His empire had been built on sand, and the tide had finally come in. In court 3 months later, Kieran arrived with a cheap lawyer he'd found through an online ad, someone young and inexperienced. He expected at least a fair fight, maybe a 50-50 split of assets like most divorces. Instead, Patricia presented our prenuptial agreement to the judge, highlighting the infidelity and financial misconduct clauses in fluorescent yellow. She laid out bank statements showing the hotel charges, the secret account, the padded invoices, the misappropriated company funds. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, reviewed every document carefully and thoroughly. Kieran's lawyer tried to argue that the prenup was too old to enforce and shouldn't apply anymore. The judge cut him off mid-sentence with a wave of her hand. "The agreement is valid and crystal clear. Mr. Porter engaged in both infidelity and financial deception, as proven extensively by these documents." She turned to Kieran with obvious disapproval. "You used marital and business funds for an extramarital affair while defrauding clients. These are not minor infractions or mistakes." When she ruled that I would retain the house, majority business ownership, and primary custody of Logan, Kieran actually gasped out loud. His lawyer looked defeated and embarrassed. He'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd cheated himself out of everything that mattered. After the court ruling became public record, Kieran's phone went completely silent. Friends who used to invite him fishing or to weekend barbecues stopped calling entirely. Their wives had seen the court documents and wanted distance from the scandal and drama. His parents, who'd initially blamed me for not being more understanding of his needs, called to apologize after his mother read the evidence Patricia had sent them as a courtesy. "We had no idea what he'd done," his mother said, her voice thick with shame and disappointment. "We raised him better than this." Logan, mature enough at 18 to understand what had happened and make his own choices, chose to live with me full-time. He agreed to see his father during scheduled visits, but the easy closeness they'd once shared was gone, replaced by polite distance. I watched Kieran show up for his first visitation looking smaller, somehow, diminished, his shoulders hunched and his eyes avoiding mine. The man who'd once walked into rooms like he owned them, confident and charismatic, now waited nervously in driveways, hoping his son would still open the door and give him a chance. His fall from grace was complete and public, witnessed by everyone who'd once admired him. I rebranded the company under a new name, Porter Advisory and Renovation, keeping my maiden name prominently displayed. I repositioned it as both a renovation firm and a business consultancy, specifically for women entering male-dominated industries. I started offering evening workshops on understanding contracts, prenuptial agreements, and ownership structures that protected assets. My story, shared carefully and without identifying names at first, resonated deeply with women across the city. Women came to me whispering, "I wish I'd known this before I signed everything over to him," their voices full of regret. The business grew faster than I'd imagined possible, fueled by word of mouth and genuine need. Clients specifically requested to work with a woman-owned company they could trust. Local news covered my workshops, calling them empowering and essential. A business magazine featured me in their Entrepreneurs to Watch section with a full-page photo. I'd finally returned to the dreams I'd abandoned at 28, but stronger, wiser, and completely in control of my destiny. Logan helped with social media marketing during his summer break before college, proud of what we were building together. We were healing slowly. We were thriving. We were proof that betrayal doesn't have to mean destruction. One evening in late autumn, as I locked up my new office downtown in a building I'd always admired, I found Kieran waiting by the glass door. He looked older than his years, worn down by months of consequences and isolation. His suit didn't fit right anymore, hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight from stress. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice lacking its former confidence. I glanced at my watch deliberately. "I have 5 minutes before I need to leave." He swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize what I had with you, what I threw away for something meaningless." His voice cracked with emotion. "Tessa's gone. She left when the money dried up. The business I tried to start failed completely. My parents barely speak to me anymore." I waited, saying nothing, giving him no comfort. "Is there any way we could start over? Go to counseling maybe? Or at least be friends like we used to be?" I looked at him and felt nothing. Not hatred or anger, not love or longing. Just the distant recognition of someone I used to know in another lifetime. "We were never friends, Kieran," I said quietly but firmly. "I was your safety net and your backup plan. There's a difference." His face crumpled. "So that's it? 20 years means absolutely nothing?" I took a breath, choosing my words carefully because I wanted him to understand completely. "I forgave you," I said, watching his face transform with desperate hope. "For my own peace and healing, not to give you another chance." His eyes filled with tears. I held up my hand to stop him from speaking. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation or pretending this didn't happen. It doesn't mean I trust you or that you didn't make deliberate choices for years." I thought about the woman I'd been, always accommodating, always understanding, always putting everyone else first. "You taught me something valuable," I continued. "You taught me to read the fine print, to document everything carefully, to protect myself legally and financially. I just never expected you'd be the biggest risk I needed protection from." Kieran's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I know I don't deserve your help, but I need it. I can't find work anywhere. Nobody will hire me after everything that happened." "That's not my problem anymore," I interrupted, gently but firmly. "You made choices knowing the potential consequences. Now you live with them, just like I'm living with mine." I stepped around him toward my car, my heels clicking on the pavement. Kieran called after me one last time, his voice breaking with desperation. "Was any of it real? Did you ever really love me?" I paused with my hand on the car door, considering the question seriously. "I loved who I thought you were," I said honestly, looking back at him. "But that person might never have existed outside my imagination." I got in my car and started the engine, adjusting my mirrors. Through the window, I watched him standing alone under the streetlight, a man who'd gambled everything on lies and lost it all. I felt a twinge of something. Not pity exactly. Maybe just sadness for wasted years and broken promises. Then I drove away carefully, heading home to the house I'd kept, the business I'd saved and rebuilt, and the son who was waiting for dinner and conversation. Behind me, Kieran grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until he disappeared completely from view. Ahead of me stretched a future I'd built entirely alone, funded by my own hard work, protected by my own careful foresight and planning. And this time, my name was on every document, every deed, every decision that mattered in my life. This time, I owned my own story completely, and nobody could take that away from me ever again.